The silence at my father's funeral in Willow Creek Estates shattered when Karen Whitaker, our self-appointed HOA queen, stood to speak. "She is not Richard's biological daughter," she announced, and every head turned to face me. I held my breath, my spine rigid. What Karen didn't know was that Dad's lawyer was sitting in the back pew, holding a thick wax-sealed envelope. As he rose from his seat, her smirk began to fade. The one rebuttal she never saw coming was about to begin. "My name is Olivia Hayes. I'm 34. The air inside the Willow Creek Community Clubhouse was thick and heavy, a suffocating perfume of lilies and the damp wool of coats, still wet from the morning's persistent drizzle. Light fractured into shards of sapphire and blood red by the stained glass windows bearing the neighborhood crest, bled across the polished oak of my father's casket. It was a beautiful solemn scene curated to project an image of dignified grief for the passing of Richard Hayes, the man who literally built Willow Creek Estates from an empty field and an unshakable vision of orderly living. I stood beside his memorial portrait, a photograph from 5 years ago where his eyes still held that spark of defiance against the illness that would eventually claim him. A draft snaked in from the heavy oak doors each time they opened, and my hands, clasped in front of me, were numb with a cold that had nothing to do with the weather. Then she made her entrance. Karen Whitaker glided down the center aisle, not like a grieving neighbor, but like a host arriving at her own HOA gala. She wore a black dress so meticulously tailored it seemed molded to her skin, a stark canvas for the 7 gold bangles that clattered with practiced carelessness on her wrist. She paused to offer a tight, sympathetic smile to the local reporter from the Willow Creek Gazette, then a solemn nod to the other board members. Her performance flawless. She was a master of optics, a woman who understood that in our little kingdom of beige houses and perfectly mowed lawns, perception wasn't just reality. It was the only currency that mattered. She settled into the front pew, her grief as exquisitely arranged as the diamonds on her fingers and the HOA fines she loved handing out for grass half an inch too tall. The service was a blur of platitudes and somber organ music. I kept my gaze fixed on the casket, focusing on the intricate grain of the wood, anchoring myself to something solid, something real. The priest, a kind man with tired eyes, concluded his eulogy with a final resonant amen that hung in the air for a moment, promising peace. It was in that fragile silence that Karen moved. She rose with a fluid reptilian grace, stepping toward the lectern and adjusting the microphone. A brief squeal of feedback cut through the quiet, making several people flinch. She cleared her throat, her expression a careful mask of sorrowful duty. "Before we lay my beloved neighbor Richard to rest," she began, her voice smooth and clear, amplified throughout the cavernous clubhouse, "there is a community truth that must be brought into the light. A difficult, painful truth. A current of anticipation rippled through the pews. This was not part of the program. I could feel the collective lean-in of the audience. The board members, their faces impassive but their eyes sharp. The investors in our little homeowner's paradise. The local reporters who had just been handed a story far more compelling than a standard obituary. They had all come to pay respects to the founder of Willow Creek. And now they were about to be rewarded with a spectacle. "Olivia," Karen said, her voice dropping with false pity as she turned her head slightly toward me, "is a woman Richard cared for deeply, but she is not his daughter." The words landed with the force of a physical blow. A low hiss of whispers erupted, spreading like wildfire through the crowd of perfectly manicured residents. It was a perfectly executed HOA assassination disguised as a personal revelation. In one sentence, she had attempted to sever my connection, my legitimacy, my entire claim to the Hayes legacy house and the controlling voting bloc my father had built into the covenants. She was declaring me a fraud in a clubhouse full of witnesses who lived and died by those same rules she now twisted. I didn't look at her. I didn't turn to face the curious, pitying, or scornful stares. Instead, I stared straight ahead at my father's portrait and focused on my breathing. In for 4 counts. Hold for 4. Out for 4. The rhythm was a metronome against the rising chaos. My father's voice echoed in my memory. A low rumble from a late-night conversation in his study just 6 months ago when he knew his time was running out. "They will come for you, Olivia," he had warned, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "They will use emotion, public opinion, anything they can. You don't have to be louder than them. You just have to have the right paperwork." Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Chad Whitaker, Karen's son, standing near a stone pillar. He was holding his phone up, the small red light indicating he was recording. A faint, smug smile played on his lips. He wasn't just a spectator. He was a producer, eagerly capturing the drama for a future viral post or, more likely, to use against me in the next board vote. A public shaming that would echo far beyond the beige walls of the clubhouse. He was waiting for my reaction, for the tears, the outburst, the confirmation of my complete and utter ruin. He would be disappointed because then another figure rose from the back of the clubhouse. It was Harlan Reed, my father's lawyer for over 40 years, the tall, gaunt man who favored gray suits and silence. Reed moved with a slow, deliberate purpose that commanded attention more effectively than any shout. In his hand, he held a large manila envelope thick with documents and sealed with a circle of dark blue wax bearing the Hayes family crest. He didn't rush. He walked down the aisle with the steady, unhurried pace of a man who knows he holds the winning hand. I saw Karen's eyes narrow. She watched him, her lips pressing into a thin, hard line. The triumphant smile faltered for a fraction of a second, replaced by a flicker of confusion, but then it returned, even more confident than before. She believed she had won. She had deployed the ultimate weapon, the irrefutable truth of biology. And in her mind, no legal document could argue with DNA. She likely assumed Reed was walking up to perform damage control, to usher me away quietly, to begin negotiations for a severance of my rights in the community. She had profoundly misunderstood the man my father was and the daughter he had raised. My fingers found the simple silver ring on my right hand, a band my father had given me on my 16th birthday. It was cool against my skin. I began to twist it, a nervous habit I'd had since childhood. But today it wasn't about anxiety. It was a signal to myself. A final check of the system. The pieces were in place. The trap had been sprung, not by me, but by her own greed. All I had to do was wait for the mechanism to work. I kept my back straight, my eyes forward, and my expression unreadable. I waited for the reply my father had prepared long ago. As Harlan Reed's polished leather shoes clicked with unnerving rhythm against the tiled floor, my mind drifted to a photograph. It ran 2 years ago in the local paper. A full-page spread under the headline, "The Hayes Dynasty, Willow Creek's Vision for the Next Generation." In it, my father Richard stood tall and formidable, his hand resting on Karen's shoulder. She was radiant, smiling a practiced $1 million smile, her posture exuding the effortless confidence of a woman who had married into power and made it her own. They were positioned in front of the gleaming clubhouse facade, a monument to my father's ambition. I was not in the picture. The article mentioned me once. A brief dismissive line about a daughter from a previous relationship who prefers a private life. It was a masterpiece of public relations. A perfect community portrait with the inconvenient brushstroke carefully painted out. The truth was I had never been part of that portrait. My first 12 years were spent in a quiet, unassuming town upstate with my mother. After she passed, my father, a man I had known only through sporadic, guilt-ridden phone calls and generous checks, came to collect me. I arrived at the sprawling Willow Creek estate with a single suitcase and the perpetually startled expression of a stray. "Karen, his wife of 3 years, greeted me at the door. She never said a cruel word to my face. Not in the beginning. Her cruelty was more insidious, a thing of whispers and labels. To her friends, to the staff, and in every action she took. I was the charity project. I was Richard's act of penance. A past indiscretion he was now forced to house and clothe. She treated my presence as a temporary inconvenience, like a leaky roof that would eventually be repaired and forgotten. Her own son Chad was the designated heir. He was given everything I was denied. The fawning attention, the assumption of brilliance, the frictionless path. While I was learning the value of keeping my head down, Chad was learning the art of self-promotion. He was handed the title of Junior Compliance Officer for the HOA. Upon graduating with a liberal arts degree, his resume was a phantom document, a collection of weekend seminars on synergistic neighborhood management that he'd attended in luxury hotels. He produced nothing of value. His primary contribution being PowerPoint presentations filled with corporate buzzwords and stock photos of happy homeowners. Yet, he drew a salary that could have funded an entire landscaping crew. He was the embodiment of unearned privilege, a walking, talking testament to the power of a name he hadn't built. Our family dinners were Karen's stage, seated at the head of a long mahogany table in the clubhouse. She would hold court, delivering long, meandering monologues. Her favorite topics were bloodlines and innate talent. She would praise Chad's natural leadership, claiming he inherited it directly from her side of the family, a lineage of supposed community aristocrats. Some things just can't be taught. Richard, she would say, her eyes flicking to me for a fraction of a second. It's in the breeding. A thoroughbred is a thoroughbred. You can't train a cart horse to win the derby. My father would just stir his soup, his silence a heavy, complicated thing. In those moments, I learned to eat my food, to make myself small, to become part of the wallpaper. I was the cart horse at the banquet, and I knew it. But my father had his own quieter way of teaching. He saw that Karen was schooling me in the art of social invisibility. So, he decided to teach me the language of actual power. Late at night, long after Karen and Chad had retired, he would lead me not to the boardroom, but to the basement of the clubhouse, to the community archives. The room smelled of aging paper and the faint ozone from the humming servers that stored every fine, every covenant violation, every petty rule ever enforced. There, surrounded by endless rows of gray filing cabinets and dusty ledger books, he gave me my real education. "Look here, Olivia," he'd murmur, his large hand guiding mine across a page of dense figures. "This is a vendor invoice. See this consulting fee? It's a ghost. A kickback disguised as a service." He taught me how to read a balance sheet. Not just the top line, but the footnotes where the truth was often buried. He showed me how to trace payments, how to spot phantom contracts, how to follow the money until it told its story. While Chad was being paraded at community events, I was given a desk in a windowless office in the internal compliance department. It was a corporate monastery, a place of silent, meticulous work. I had no title that would impress anyone at a block party. I attended no press conferences. My name appeared in a community newsletter once. My job was to be the neighborhood's conscience, its memory. My job was to ensure the numbers didn't lie. And from that vantage point, I saw everything. I saw the strategic fees paid to shell companies owned by Chad's friends. I saw the inflated contracts awarded to Karen's preferred vendors. I saw the slow, steady siphoning of the community funds my father had built. As my father's illness progressed, Karen's ambition became more naked. She began positioning herself as the natural successor, the grieving but capable president ready to take the reins. She charmed the board, hosted lavish dinners for residents, and carefully cultivated her image as the keeper of Richard's legacy. She knew that to secure the president's seat permanently, she needed absolute control. I was the only obstacle. I held no official power. But she knew what my father had taught me. She knew I understood the community's real machinery. An anonymous auditor could become a very dangerous threat. She needed me gone, not just physically removed, but erased from the narrative, delegitimized on paper and in public opinion. One evening, after a particularly draining board meeting where Karen had effectively silenced a dissenting voice with a veiled threat of fines, my father called me into his study. He looked frail, the fight draining from him, but his eyes were sharp. "She's good at this," he said, his voice a low rasp. "Karen understands the theater. She understands media, perception, headlines. That's her battlefield." He looked at me, his gaze intense. "But you, Olivia, you understand the clauses, the fine print, the binding, inescapable truth of a covenant." That was the moment the war shifted for me. I finally understood the role he had been grooming me for. He wasn't raising a daughter. He was training a successor, but one who would operate from the shadows, armed with facts, not sound bites. From that day on, I learned to speak less and document more. I learned that a signed affidavit was more powerful than a shouted accusation. I learned that the most important conversations happen in the presence of a notary. Every significant piece of paper, every trust document, every signed declaration, every preemptive legal strategy we devised together was not kept in the house where it could be found and destroyed. It was all filed away safely and silently in a fireproof vault in the downtown offices of Reed and Associates. Now, as Harlan Reed reached the front of the clubhouse, placing the thick manila envelope on the lectern with a soft but definitive thud, I saw the culmination of all those quiet lessons. Karen was playing to the audience. My father had prepared me to speak to the judge. She had brought a story to a funeral. He had brought the law. Harlan Reed did not acknowledge Karen. Nor did he look at me. His focus was entirely on the lectern and the thick envelope in his hands. He broke the wax seal with a precise crack that echoed in the silent clubhouse. The sound was a punctuation mark, the end of one sentence and the beginning of another. He slid a sheaf of documents from the envelope, their edges crisp and sharp. The air in the clubhouse, already thick with grief and tension, now seemed to vibrate with a new energy, the cold, unassailable power of the law. Karen watched him, a faint, condescending smile on her lips. She crossed her arms, the gold bangles making a soft, defiant clink. She believed this was a formality, a prelude to a negotiation she was certain to win. "Before we proceed," Reed began, his voice calm and measured, carrying to every corner of the space without any need for the microphone Karen had used. "It is my duty as legal counsel for the estate of Richard Hayes to clarify a point of fact that has been publicly challenged." He held up the first document. "This is a declaration of paternity filed under the statutes of the state. It is dated February 14th, 20 years ago. It is signed by Richard Hayes and notarized by a public official. It legally establishes Richard Hayes as the father of Olivia Hayes." A low murmur rippled through the pews. Karen's smile tightened. A declaration was one thing, biology another. This was a skirmish she could still win. Reed placed that document aside and lifted another. "This is an official finalized adoption decree from the state family court. It was completed when Olivia Hayes was 13 years old. For those unfamiliar with the law, let me be perfectly clear. This document legally severs any and all consideration of biological parentage. It establishes a parent-child relationship that is permanent, absolute, and by law cannot be challenged or nullified by any subsequent genetic testing in the eyes of the law and for all legal and financial purposes. Olivia Hayes is and forever will be the daughter of Richard Hayes. The matter is legally incontestable." The room fell completely silent. The word incontestable hung in the air like a guillotine. Karen's face had gone rigid, the condescending smile frozen in place, now looking more like a pained grimace. She had built her entire attack on the foundation of bloodlines. And Reed had just demolished it with 2 pieces of paper. But he was just getting started. This was merely the foundation. Now came the structure of the fortress my father had built around me. Next, Reed said, picking up a thicker document bound in a dark blue cover, the updated Hayes Family Covenant Agreement ratified by Mr. Hayes 3 months ago. He let his gaze sweep across the front pews where the board members sat. As per this agreement, Richard Hayes's personal controlling stake in the Willow Creek HOA Association, representing 27% of all voting power, is to be transferred immediately upon his death into the newly formed Hayes Legacy Trust. He paused, letting the weight of that sink in. The primary beneficiary and sole trustee of the Hayes Legacy Trust is Olivia Hayes. This position grants her full and unrestricted proxy over all 27% of those voting rights. A sharp intake of breath came from Karen's direction. 27%. It was a kingmaker's stake. Enough to sway any board vote, to challenge any petty fine, enough to grant effective control of the entire neighborhood. And now, Reed said, his voice dropping slightly, drawing everyone in, we come to the specific provisions Mr. Hayes insisted upon. He called them his contingency protocols. He was now looking directly at Karen. I will read directly from Article 4, Section 3B, also known as the No Contest and Bad Faith Clause. He cleared his throat. Should any named beneficiary of the Richard Hayes estate publicly denigrate, challenge, or otherwise attempt to undermine the legal standing or familial relationship of Olivia Hayes, that beneficiary will be considered to have acted in bad faith. Such an act will trigger immediate and irrevocable forfeiture of any and all benefits, assets, or appointments granted to them by this estate. The silence in the clubhouse was now absolute, heavy, and suffocating. Every eye was on Karen. Her face had drained of color, leaving 2 angry patches of blush on her cheeks. Furthermore, Reed pressed on relentlessly, a related provision, the springing proxy clause. This pertains to the 18% of association voting rights currently held by Karen Whitaker, rights gifted to her by my client over the course of their marriage. He held up another page. This clause states that should the holder of these rights, Karen Whitaker, engage in a public act of bad faith as defined in the aforementioned clause, her voting rights for those shares will be temporarily and immediately transferred to a designated appointee until such a time as the board can convene to assess fiduciary harm. The designated appointee in this scenario is Olivia Hayes. He placed the final document down. The trap was now fully revealed. Karen hadn't just spoken out of turn at a funeral. She had triggered a series of legal dominoes designed for this exact moment. The activation of these clauses, Reed explained patiently as if to a child, requires 2 things. First, public statement. Second, the presence of witnesses. He gestured broadly to the assembled mourners. The official funeral registry signed by every person here, including members of the board and the press, establishes the list of witnesses. The clubhouse's own audio system, which was active, provides a clear time-stamped recording of the statement. He then turned his head slightly toward Chad. And I believe we also have a video recording being made by Mr. Chad Whitaker, which can be subpoenaed as further corroborating evidence. Chad's eyes widened. His hand holding the phone froze in midair. Reed turned to the priest who had been watching the proceedings with a stunned expression. Father Michael, for the record, did Mrs. Karen Whitaker just moments ago use this lectern to publicly declare that Olivia Hayes was not Richard Hayes's daughter? The priest swallowed hard. Yes, he said, his voice barely a whisper. But it was enough. Yes, she did. The weight of it all finally seemed to land on Karen. but her arrogance was a fortress not easily breached. She let out a short, sharp laugh, a sound utterly out of place in the solemnity of the clubhouse. "This is absurd," she scoffed, her voice high and brittle. "It was just words, a statement of fact. You can't disinherit someone for telling the truth." Reed looked at her, and for the first time a flicker of something other than professional detachment crossed his face. It was a cold intellectual pity. "You are mistaken, Mrs. Whitaker," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper yet carrying the finality of a judge's sentence. "The law has a very specific and comprehensive definition for the act of publication, and you, madam, in front of this entire assembly, have just published." Too late. Chad lowered his phone, the red light winking out. The smug confidence had vanished from his face, replaced by the dawning, sickening horror of understanding. He hadn't just been recording his mother's triumph. He had been documenting her self-destruction. Reed's words hung in the air, a verdict delivered before the trial had even begun. Karen's face was a canvas of disbelief, her mind clearly scrambling to find a foothold in the legal landslide that was burying her. "Published," she repeated, her voice a thin, reedy thing. "This is a funeral, not a newspaper." "The venue is irrelevant," Reed replied, his composure absolute. He reached into his coat pocket and produced a small silver digital audio recorder. He pressed a button. A small click, then a horrifyingly clear reproduction of Karen's voice filled the clubhouse. "Before we lay my beloved Richard to rest, there is a community truth that must be brought into the light. Olivia is not his daughter." The recording was pristine. Every carefully enunciated syllable, every drop of feigned sympathy was captured and amplified, played back to the very witnesses she had sought to sway. He let the recording play for a few seconds longer, capturing the initial shocked whispers of the crowd before clicking it off. The silence that rushed back in was heavier than before. Her act of publication was no longer a matter of memory. It was a piece of evidence, Reed said as if anticipating her next objection. "My client understood that you would attack him through her, through legal documents you would claim were drafted under duress. He knew you would question his intent, so he decided to speak for himself." From the large manila envelope, Reed produced a slim tablet. He turned it on, the screen glowing to life. He turned it to face the pews, the image large and clear enough for everyone in the front half of the clubhouse to see. It was my father. He was seated in his favorite leather armchair in his study, the familiar mahogany bookshelves behind him. He looked thinner, the lines on his face carved deeper by his illness, but his eyes were blazing with a fierce, undiminished clarity. He wasn't looking at the camera. He was looking at me. It felt as though he were in the room, his gaze cutting through the screen and finding mine. "If you are watching this, Olivia," he began, his voice raspy but firm, "it means I'm gone, and it means Karen and Chad have done exactly what I predicted they would do. They have chosen to attack you publicly, to sever your name from mine in the hope of seizing control of what I built." Karen let out a choked gasp. My father on the screen continued as if he had heard her. "This video is being recorded on October the 5th, 1 week before my scheduled admission to the hospital. Let the record show that I am of sound mind and body, and this is my final binding directive regarding the governance of my estate and the association." He picked up a document from the table beside him, a copy of the very agreement Reed now held. "I am reading now from the no contest and bad faith clause," he said, his eyes scanning the page. "Any beneficiary who publicly attempts to undermine Olivia Hayes's legal standing as my daughter forfeits all rights to their inheritance. This is not a punishment, Olivia," he said, looking back up, his expression softening for a moment. "It is a shield to protect you, and to protect the community from those who value greed over loyalty." He turned a page. "Furthermore," I am reading from the springing proxy clause. Upon the activation of the bad faith provision, any and all voting rights held by Karen Whitaker will have their proxy rights immediately and temporarily transferred. I hereby designate the recipient of that proxy to be the trustee of the Hayes Legacy Trust. He paused, and his eyes found the lens once more. And that trustee, Olivia, is you. A wave of shock rolled through the clubhouse. This was no longer a lawyer's interpretation. This was Richard Hayes himself from beyond the grave, handing me the keys to his kingdom. Finally, my father said, a grim finality in his tone. I must ensure the board understands the gravity of this directive. He looked off camera. Mr. Albright, Mr. Cho, he said, naming the two longest-serving independent board members, both of whom were now sitting ramrod straight in the second pew. You were both present when I signed this provision. You have both co-signed a document acknowledging your understanding of its terms and its automatic non-negotiable activation. I expect you to honor your fiduciary duty and uphold my will. He leaned back in his chair, his energy spent. That is all, he said. The video ended. The screen went black. The silence that followed was a physical presence. Pressed down on us. Thick and absolute. The whispers were gone. There was only the stunned stillness of 100 people processing the meticulous, posthumous execution they had just witnessed. Then Karen found her voice, a raw, ragged shriek that tore through the quiet. He was sick. That video proves nothing. He was on medication. He wasn't in his right mind. It's invalid. Read. You coerced him. It was her final desperate gambit. The last refuge of the defeated to paint the man whose legacy she claimed to cherish as a senile, manipulated invalid. Harlan Reed did not even flinch. He simply reached back into his seemingly bottomless envelope and retrieved one last single sheet of paper. I anticipated you would make that claim, Mrs. Whitaker, he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. Which is why I have this. He held it up. This is a signed and dated letter from Dr. Alistair Finch, your husband's private physician and a respected neurologist. It is a formal assessment of cognitive function, conducted on the morning of October the 5th, the same day the video was recorded. States, and I quote, Mr. Richard Hayes is fully lucid, possesses complete command of his faculties, and is entirely competent to make financial and legal decisions. It is signed, notarized, and legally binding. Checkmate. The fight drained out of Karen in an instant. Her face, which had been flushed with rage, went slack with the pale, sickly color of utter defeat. The mask didn't just crack. It disintegrated, revealing the raw, avaricious woman beneath. Her mouth hung slightly open, her eyes darting around the room as if searching for an ally, a loophole, an escape. She found none. I risked a glance at Chad. He had his phone jammed deep in his pocket now. His face was ashen. He was no longer a smug producer of viral content. He was a co-conspirator in a failed coup, and he knew it. His eyes were wide with panic, darting not towards his mother, but towards the heavy oak doors at the back of the clubhouse. He was looking for an exit. Harlan Reed gathered his papers, tapping them into a neat stack on the lectern. He looked out over the silent assembly, his gaze finally resting on Karen. Therefore, he announced, his voice ringing with the cold clarity of legal finality. As per the clauses explicitly outlined and validated by Mr. Hayes himself, I must make two declarations, effective immediately. He paused, letting the silence stretch, ensuring every single person was hanging on his next words. First, the voting rights for the 18% of the association held by Karen Whitaker are, as of this moment, temporarily transferred to the control of Olivia Hayes. A bolt of lightning, the power had shifted. And second, he said, delivering the fatal blow, Due to her public act of bad faith against a legal heir, Karen Whitaker has, as of this moment, forfeited any and all rights and benefits from the Richard Hayes estate and its associated trusts. A second bolt, the prize she had killed for, was gone. Reed's two declarations fell into the silence of the clubhouse like stones into a deep well. The ripples spread instantly, not in whispers, but in a sudden collective shift of posture. The air of a funeral had evaporated, replaced by the charged, predatory stillness of a boardroom. Before Karen could even form a response, a man in the second pew stood up. It was Marcus Albright, the most senior independent board member, a man whose face seemed permanently etched with an expression of grim fiscal responsibility. His black morning suit might as well have been pinstripes. He was followed by David Cho and Eleanor Evans, the other two independent board members. They stood as a single dark block. "Mr. Reed," Albright said, his voice a low baritone that cut through the tension. "This new information presents a significant and immediate risk to the stability of the association. We require an emergency board vote." He did not look at the casket or the priest. He looked at Reed and then at me. "The vestry. Now." It was not a suggestion. It was a command. The funeral was over. The board meeting had begun. Reed gave a single curt nod. He gathered his documents with practiced efficiency as Albright, Cho, and Evans turned and began walking toward a heavy wooden door to the side of the altar. The other mourners, the residents, the managers, the press parted for them, their faces a mixture of awe and morbid curiosity. This was the real main event, and it was happening behind closed doors. As I moved to follow, Karen lunged, grabbing my arm. Her grip was surprisingly strong, her nails digging into the fabric of my sleeve. "You will not do this," she hissed, her face contorted. The mask of the grieving neighbor, now a grotesque parody. "This is my association, my life." I didn't pull away. I simply looked down at her hand, then back to her face, my expression blank. "It was never your association," I said, my voice quiet. "You were just married to the man who built it." I gently detached her hand from my arm and walked away, leaving her standing alone in the aisle. The vestry was a small, cold room paneled in dark wood and smelling of old hymnals and beeswax. A simple oak table stood in the center. Albright, Cho, and Evans took seats on one side. Reed stood at the head, placing his tablet and the key documents on the polished surface. He was no longer just a lawyer. He was the executive, the arbiter of this brutal transition. He handed each director a single-page summary. "The legal standing is clear," Reed stated, his voice clipped and precise. "The articles of the estate have been triggered. Olivia Hayes, as trustee, now controls her father's 27% voting stake. The springing proxy clause, also triggered, transfers the voting rights of Karen Whitaker's 18% stake to Olivia Hayes. The math is simple. As of 5 minutes ago, Olivia controls a 45% voting block. It is, for all intents and purposes, a controlling interest." Just then, the door burst open. Karen stood there, her chest heaving with Chad hovering uselessly behind her. She had her phone pressed to her ear. "Get down here now," she was whispering frantically into it. "He's invoking some insane clause. They're trying to steal everything. Where is my lawyer?" I looked at her, my first moment of direct tactical engagement. "You might want to read page 12 of the covenant agreement, Karen," I said, my voice even and calm. The section titled, "Immediate Effect After Contrary Proceedings." "Dad knew you wouldn't be able to resist a stage." Her eyes widened. The realization that this wasn't just a legal maneuver, but a meticulously planned ambush designed around her own predictable behavior, seemed to hit her with the force of a physical blow. Chad stepped forward, puffing out his chest in a pathetic imitation of his father's authority. This is an abuse of process. It's a hostile takeover at a funeral. This is completely unethical. Albright didn't even turn his head. You are not a voting member, Mr. Whitaker, he said, his voice like ice. You are not an officer of this association. You are a guest at a funeral that has concluded. You have no standing here. Please be silent. Chad deflated, shrinking back behind his mother as if the words themselves had pushed him. Albright rapped his knuckles on the table. Let's proceed. I move to vote on the immediate removal of Karen Whitaker from the position of president on the grounds of acting in a manner deliberately detrimental to the association's reputation and resident stability. I second, Cho said instantly. I second, Evans said. A fourth board member, a man named Peterson who owed his position entirely to Karen, stammered, I must abstain pending legal review. Albright looked at me. Olivia. I second, I said. The motion passes 4-1 with one abstention, Albright declared, his tone flat. Karen Whitaker is removed as president. Effective immediately. A strangled cry escaped Karen's throat. You bastards. You can't. I am his widow. Richard would never have allowed this. On the contrary, Reed interjected smoothly. He orchestrated it. Albright ignored her completely. Next motion. I move to appoint Olivia Hayes as interim president to stabilize leadership and oversee a full internal audit effective immediately. I second, Cho said. I second, Evans said. I looked at Peterson, who was now sweating profusely. He saw the power shift, the new gravitational center forming around me. I second, he mumbled, his eyes on the table. The motion passes 5-0 with one abstention, Albright announced. Congratulations, Madam President. Karen let out a full-throated scream of rage. You will not get away with this. I will sue you all into the ground. You dare. Reed slid a printed resolution and a heavy black fountain pen across the table to me. A formality, he said. I picked up the pen. Felt cool and solid in my hand. I remembered all the nights in the archives, the smell of dust and paper, my father's voice explaining the difference between compliance fees and actual enforcement. I remembered his words. You don't have to be louder. You just need the right paperwork. My hand did not shake as I signed my name, Olivia Hayes, on the line. The ink was dark and permanent. At that exact moment, from the bell tower outside the clubhouse, the great bronze bell of Willow Creek began to toll. It was noon. The sound wasn't melodic. It was deep and percussive, each powerful chime falling like a judge's gavel, sealing the verdict, marking the end of an era. 1, 2, 3 all the way to 12. As the last chime faded, a young man in a dark suit, an assistant to the board I recognized but had never spoken to, stepped silently into the room. He walked to my side and held out a small velvet box. I opened it. Inside, resting on white satin, was the president's pin, a small, elegant W of gold and navy enamel. I took it from the box. It was heavier than it looked, solid and real, to fit perfectly in the palm of my hand. I did not pin the emblem to my lapel. I simply closed the velvet box and placed it on the table in front of me. A small dark promise. Karen was still sputtering, a litany of threats and legal challenges. But her words had lost their weight. They were just noise now, the chaotic aftermath of an explosion. The men and women at the table, the board, were no longer looking at her. Their attention was a tangible force, and it was now focused entirely on me. They were waiting for my first act as president. I didn't speak. Instead, I reached for my briefcase, retrieved my iPad, and placed it on the table next to the velvet box. I unlocked the screen with my thumb. The cool white light cut through the gloom of the vestry, illuminating the grim faces of the directors. On the screen was not a speech, but a spreadsheet. It was a document I had been building for 18 months, a silent, meticulous catalog of theft. Before we discuss the future of Willow Creek, I said, my voice as level and dispassionate as the grid lines on the screen, we must first understand its recent past. I turned the iPad so the directors could see. This is a detailed analysis of all discretionary spending and third-party vendor fees, approved by the President's office over the last fiscal year. My finger tapped on a folder and it opened to reveal a list of invoices. Specifically, I'd like to draw your attention to payments made to a vendor named Whitaker Compliance Solutions LLC, Chad, who had been trying to make himself invisible behind his mother, flinched as if he'd been struck. Whitaker Compliance Solutions, I continued, is a limited liability company registered 6 months ago. The sole proprietor is Chad Whitaker. In the past 2 quarters, it has billed the association for $475,000. Albright leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. For what services? I tapped on the highest line item. An invoice filled the screen. This one, for example, is for $280,000. The services listed as Strategic Synergy and Rule Realignment Consultation. I swiped to the next page, which showed the deliverable for that fee. It was a PowerPoint presentation. 7 slides. I clicked through them slowly. The first was a title slide with our association logo slightly askew. The next 5 were filled with generic business aphorisms and stock photos of smiling, ethnically diverse homeowners in a perfect neighborhood. The final slide just said questions in a large bold font. Our internal analysis, I said, my voice flat, shows that this presentation is a lightly modified version of a free template available on a dozen marketing websites. The work product for which this company was billed the equivalent of 4 senior salaries appears to be worth approximately 0. I didn't need to editorialize. The numbers on the invoice set against the pathetic reality of the 7 slides did all the work. The air in the room grew colder. It goes further, I said, navigating to a different folder. Let's examine procurement. I brought up the minutes from a recent executive meeting, a section I had highlighted in red. Karen, in her capacity as president, unilaterally overruled the procurement committee's recommendation to award the new community pool contract to a firm called Sterling Builders. Instead, she directed the contract to a smaller, more expensive bidder, Hollow Creek Development. I swiped again. A comparison chart appeared. Hollow Creek's bid was 32% higher than Sterling's. It was, in fact, the highest of the 4 bids received. The cost overrun to the association will be in excess of $3 million over the life of the project. Hollow Creek had a better timeline, Karen snapped, her voice defensive. It was a sound business decision. Was it? I asked, my tone dangerously soft. I brought up a final document, a record of incorporation for Hollow Creek Development. Because the public record shows that the majority shareholder in Hollow Creek is a holding company owned by the family of your late first husband. It appears less like a business decision and more like a subsidy. A muscle twitched in Albright's jaw. This was no longer just association waste. This was a clear breach of fiduciary duty. I looked directly at him. 3 months ago, I flagged both the payments to Whitaker Compliance Solutions and the Hollow Creek contract in a standard internal audit report. I sent it directly to the president. I swiped one last time, revealing a screenshot of an email. It was Karen's reply to my detailed 5-page warning. It contained only one sentence. Thank you for your input, but I will not have my business decisions questioned based on the emotional meddling of a stepdaughter. The directors read the email. The contempt was palpable. She had not only ignored the warning, she had dismissed it based on the very family dynamic she had weaponized just minutes earlier. My father, I said, locking the iPad and placing it face down, was aware of these issues, and he was aware that my access to investigate them might be compromised. I reached into my briefcase again and produced a single folded document. I passed it to Reed, who unfolded it and presented it to Albright. "This is an ethics and governance memorandum signed by Richard Hayes a month before he passed," Reed explained. "It's quite simple. It states that if Olivia Hayes's employment were to be terminated or her access to internal financial systems suspended, it would automatically trigger a full independent forensic audit of the association's books to be conducted by an external firm of my choosing, with the results to be delivered directly to the state attorney general." The board members looked at each other. The trap had been far more complex than they had imagined. My father had not just protected my inheritance. He had turned me into a human dead man's switch. If Karen had fired me to silence me, she would have unleashed the very forces she was trying to evade. Albright cleared his throat. "This is no longer a private family matter," he said, his voice grim. "This is a significant legal and financial risk to the association." Chad suddenly surged forward. "I was just trying to help," he blurted out, his voice cracking with panic. "I have ideas. I was bringing a fresh perspective." I looked at him, my expression unreadable. "By billing the association $250,000 for a 7-page book report?" He had no answer. Reed stepped forward, his presence filling the small room. "The board should also be aware," he said calmly, "of the clawback provision in the association's code of conduct, which Mr. Hayes himself helped draft. Any officer or consultant found to have received compensation under false pretenses or for services not rendered is liable to the association for the full amount. The association has a right, indeed a duty to its residents, to reclaim those funds." Suddenly, no one was thinking about the funeral anymore. The smell of lilies and rain-soaked wool had been replaced by the sterile metallic scent of money stolen and money to be reclaimed. The focus in the room had contracted, shifting from the grand emotional theater in the clubhouse to the cold hard numbers on a glowing screen. The accusations weren't coming from me anymore. They were coming from the balance sheet. And the numbers, unlike people, do not lie. They simply state what is. And what they were stating in incontrovertible black and white was a story of profound and shameless corruption. The numbers from the iPad screen hung in the airless vestry, a constellation of damning evidence. The board members were silent, their faces hard and unreadable, the kind of expression people who deal in millions adopt when they smell blood in the water and a potential liability. Karen's face was a ruin, the carefully constructed edifice of her poise and power having crumbled into dust, leaving only the raw, twitching nerves of her rage and humiliation. She drew herself up, a final, desperate attempt to reclaim some shred of dignity, to appeal to a law older than any covenant. "I am his wife," she said, her voice shaking but laced with a renewed defiant fury. She wasn't speaking to the board anymore. She was pleading her case to the ghosts in the room, to some higher court of natural justice she believed must exist. "I was his legal wedded wife for 22 years. Chad is his stepson. That girl," she spat the word, jabbing a trembling finger in my direction, "is a stranger, an outsider. Blood is blood. That is a truth no piece of paper can erase." It was her last stand, an appeal to the primal, the biological, the one truth she had been so certain would be her trump card. Harlan Reed, who had remained silent throughout the financial exposé, turned his head slowly to face her. There was no anger in his expression, no triumph. If anything, there was a profound, almost weary patience, the look of a master craftsman observing a flawed and predictable piece of machinery. "The court, Mrs. Whitaker," he began, his voice soft, almost conversational, yet it cut through her emotional tirade like a surgeon's scalpel through skin, "is not a sentimental institution. It does not arbitrate feelings or traditions. It arbitrates legally binding agreements. and it does not concern itself with bloodlines when a superseding legal framework has been put in place. He picked up the document from the table, the finalized adoption decree. He held it not as a weapon, but as a textbook from which he was about to teach a final brutal lesson. Your entire argument, he continued gently, is predicated on a biological fact, a fact that my client, your late husband, rendered legally irrelevant 21 years ago. He adjusted his reading glasses, his movement slow and deliberate, drawing out the moment. Allow me to read to you the final declarative clause of this court order, the one Richard insisted be written in the plainest possible language. He looked down at the paper, his finger tracing the line of text. He read slowly, giving each word its full devastating weight. The relationship between the petitioner Richard Hayes and the minor Olivia Hayes, he read, his voice a calm, steady drone, is hereby established as a permanent and sacrosanct parent-child relationship, effective in perpetuity, and rendered legally irrevocable by any subsequent biological or genetic testing. He looked up, his eyes meeting hers over the rims of his glasses. Legally irrevocable, he repeated, letting the words settle in the suffocating silence. That is the language of the law, Mrs. Whitaker. Absolute. Final. The matter is closed. He placed the document back on the table with a soft, definitive tap. Therefore, he said, shifting from instructor to executioner, when you stood at that lectern minutes ago, you were not, as you claimed, telling the truth in the precise and unforgiving language of the law. You were committing an act of public slander against the legally established, legitimate, and irrevocable daughter of Richard Hayes. He paused. An act which you undertook of your own free will in a room full of witnesses while being recorded. He let his gaze drift from her to Chad, then to the board members, and finally back to her. He began to list her sins and their corresponding punishments, his voice never rising, never changing, a calm recitation of her doom. By doing so, you knowingly triggered the bad faith clause your husband put in place to protect his daughter. The consequences of that clause are not negotiable. They are automatic. First, the no contest provision is now active, effective immediately. You forfeit any and all rights and benefits from the Richard Hayes estate and its associated trusts. Not pending review, not subject to appeal. Immediately, the inheritance you schemed to secure is gone. Second, the springing proxy is now active, effective immediately. The voting rights attached to the 18% of association power your husband gifted you are transferred to the designated proxy Olivia Hayes. The power you sought to consolidate is also gone. He then delivered the masterstroke, the clause designed to prevent the very legal war she was likely already planning. Third, my client anticipated you would not accept this outcome gracefully. Therefore, he included a unilateral fee provision. Should you choose to challenge this outcome in court to contest the will, the trust, or the activation of these clauses in any way, you will be, by the terms of an agreement you yourself signed, personally and solely responsible for all legal fees, the fees of your own counsel, and the fees of the counsel for the estate. Win or lose, the act of filing the suit makes you liable. He has made it financially impossible for you to fight him. A small strangled sound escaped Karen's lips. The cage was not just locked. Its walls were electrified. And finally, Reed concluded, his gaze sweeping toward the board. Given the evidence presented by the new president regarding financial irregularities, potential self-dealing, and breach of fiduciary duty during your brief tenure as president, this board now has more than sufficient grounds to initiate legal proceedings against you to demand full restitution, a clawback of all funds deemed to have been improperly paid out. He looked directly at her one last time. So, not only have you lost everything you hoped to gain, Mrs. Whitaker, You now stand to lose what you have already taken. No one moved. No one spoke. The room was so quiet I could hear the faint hum of the fluorescent lights in the hallway. The only sound was the tiny sharp click as Harlan Reed replaced the cap on his fountain pen. It was the sound of a lock turning, of a cell door sliding shut. Karen took a single involuntary step backward, stumbling slightly. The last of the fight seemed to bleed out of her, leaving an empty hollowed-out shell. Her face was ashen, her eyes wide with the terrifying, complete understanding of her defeat. Chad, who had been frozen in a state of silent panic, finally moved. He took his mother's arm, his bravado gone, replaced by a desperate urgency to flee. "Mom," he whispered, his voice cracking. "We have to go. Let's just go." Reed inclined his head slightly, a gesture that was almost a bow, but held no deference. It was merely a signal that the proceeding was over. "My condolences for your loss, Mrs. Whitaker," he said, and the words were a masterpiece of professional cruelty. "And I must ask you to maintain the decorum of this funeral." Reed's final words were dismissal with a slight, almost imperceptible nod from Albright. Two discreet security guards who had been standing near the clubhouse entrance materialized at the vestry door. They did not touch Karen, but their presence was a solid, unyielding wall. Chad, looking utterly broken, pulled at her arm, and with one last venomous glare in my direction, she allowed herself to be led away. The click of the vestry door closing was the sound of a chapter ending. There was no pause, no moment of reflection. The crisis was still unfolding. "The reception hall," Albright said, his voice a low command. "We need a secure table and we need it 5 minutes ago." We moved as a single unit, a grim procession leaving the sacred space of the altar for the profane necessity of business. The main reception hall had been prepared for a traditional post-funeral gathering. Long tables were draped in white linen, laden with untouched platters of food and arrangements of somber flowers. It was a room designed for quiet condolences and shared memories. We transformed it into a war room. An assistant anticipating the need had already cleared the head table. I took the chair at the end, my father's chair. The seat was still cold. Albright and Cho sat to my right, Evans and the now compliant Peterson to my left. Harlan Reed took the seat directly opposite me, his briefcase open, his papers arranged with geometric precision. He was my counsel, my executive, my institutional memory. I did not wait for anyone else to speak. The time for observation was over. "Gentlemen, madam," I began, my voice clear and steady in the cavernous room. "Thank you for your decisive action. As of this moment, Willow Creek is in a state of extreme vulnerability. We have a leadership vacuum that has just been filled under contentious circumstances, and we have a clear and present danger from the former president. Our response must be immediate, overwhelming, and legally airtight. We have 3 priorities. 1. Containment. 2. Assessment. 3. Control of the narrative." I looked at each of them in turn, making it clear that I was not asking for opinions but outlining a strategy. "Priority 1. Containment," I said, my gaze resting on Albright. "I am formally proposing an immediate 90-day moratorium on every contract, every vendor agreement, and every capital expenditure authorized by Karen Whitaker during her tenure as president. Every single one is to be frozen pending a full legal and forensic review. The Hollow Creek development deal is Exhibit A. I have no doubt there are others. We must stop the bleeding before we can even begin to measure the wound." "I second that motion," Cho said instantly, his voice sharp. "All in favor?" I asked. A chorus of "I" came back, even from Peterson. The vote was unanimous. The first defensive wall was up. "Priority 2. Assessment," I continued, turning my attention to the entire table. "We are operating in the dark. The PowerPoint presentation and the sweetheart contract are the things I could see from my limited position. God only knows what else is buried in the books. I need the board to authorize a full unrestricted internal audit to be led by me with immediate effect. I will require full access to all servers, all financial records, and all departmental accounts. I want a preliminary report on our desks within 48 hours. The markets open tomorrow morning. When they do, we need to have at the very least a preliminary grasp of the scope of the liability. You'll have it, Evans said, her tone firm. A resolution granting you that authority will be drafted before we leave this room. Finally, I said, Priority 3, controlling the narrative. I gestured toward the main doors of the hall beyond which a crowd of reporters was surely gathering, smelling a story far bigger than the death of a founder. Karen's performance in the clubhouse was a poison pill. She tried to frame this as a messy family drama, a battle over inheritance. We will frame it as an orderly and necessary transition of leadership to protect the legacy of the founder. We will issue a press release within the hour. I began to dictate the key points, my voice crisp and devoid of emotion. The board of Willow Creek HOA expresses its profound grief at the passing of its visionary founder Richard Hayes. In accordance with a detailed succession plan prepared by Mr. Hayes himself, the board has unanimously appointed his daughter and trusted confidant Olivia Hayes as interim president. Ms. Hayes will continue her father's legacy of integrity and strategic growth. The board is united in its support of this transition and is taking all necessary steps to ensure the stability and continued success of the community. We will not be commenting on malicious and unfounded rumors which we consider a deep disrespect to the solemnity of these proceedings. As I finished, Albright nodded slowly, dignified, firm. It recenters the story on corporate governance, not family squabbles. I'll have the comms director draft it immediately based on those points. He then leaned forward, a new urgency in his eyes. Madam President, while we are securing the narrative, we must also secure the infrastructure. Karen and more specifically her son have had high-level access to our systems. We must assume that data is now at risk of being copied, altered, or destroyed. I recommend we implement a full security lockdown at the clubhouse and headquarters. An excellent point, Mr. Albright, I said. It was the opening I was waiting for. The threat is immediate. I looked to the young assistant who was taking minutes. Get me an IT directive form. Now, the assistant, a blur of efficiency, had one printed and on the table in under a minute. It was a standard employee separation form, but I was repurposing it. Under employee name, I wrote Chad Whitaker. Under action, I wrote immediate and permanent suspension of all network access, keycard privileges, and association account access. I signed it, the stroke of the pen sharp and final. I slid it across the table. Have this executed immediately, I told the assistant. I want confirmation that his access has been revoked before we leave this building. Just as the assistant was about to leave, the doors to the reception hall were pushed open with a loud bang. Karen stood there, her face a mask of pure fury, her hair slightly disheveled. She had apparently shaken off her security escort. You think you've won? She shrieked, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. This is not over. You will all regret this. I will bury this association in lawsuits. I will burn it to the ground before I let you have it. The board members stared at her, their faces impassive. She was no longer a threat, merely an embarrassment. The security guards appeared behind her again, more forceful this time. As they took her arms, she continued to rave. I stood up. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. All eyes were on me. Karen, I said, and the room fell silent. The association you are threatening to burn is no longer in your reach. It is back in the hands of the man who built it, and it is back under the protection of the law. It was a statement of fact, a declaration of the new reality. She stared at me, her mouth opening and closing, but no more words came out. The security guards escorted her from the room, her final empty threats trailing behind her. I sat back down. The tension in the room did not dissipate into relief, but solidified into a sense of grim purpose. No one smiled. No one offered congratulations. This was not a victory celebration. It was the stabilization of a patient in critical condition. Around the table, phones began to appear. Calls were being made. The work had already begun. The untouched funeral reception had become our first board meeting. An hour or perhaps a lifetime later, we were back outside. The brief, chaotic board meeting had concluded. Resolutions passed. A new order brutally established. We stepped from the cloistered silence of the reception hall back into the world. And the world was weeping. The earlier drizzle had thickened into a cold, relentless rain that fell in gray vertical sheets, drumming a somber, percussive rhythm on the black umbrellas that had bloomed across the cemetery lawn. We returned to the graveside. The small crowd that remained had huddled together. A miserable collection of dark coats and bowed heads. The pristine green of the grass was now dark and muddy. The pile of earth next to the open grave was covered by a tarp. But the rain was already turning its edges to slurry. The white lilies in the floral arrangements trembled violently under the assault of the downpour. Their petals bruised and translucent. Everything was dissolving in the rain. The priest, his robes heavy and dark with moisture, looked at me, his eyes offering a tired, genuine sympathy that felt a world away from the corporate warfare of the last hour. "Would you like to say a few words, Olivia?" he asked, his voice low, nearly lost in the steady drumming of the rain. This was the moment for eulogy, for a final public farewell, but all the words had already been spoken in the clubhouse, in the vestry, in the covenant agreements my father had so carefully drafted. The theater was over. All that remained was the truth. I shook my head. I stepped forward, leaving the shelter of Reed's umbrella, and let the cold rain plaster my hair to my forehead and run in rivulets down my face. I walked to the edge of the grave and looked down at the polished walnut casket where raindrops beaded and danced on the lid like tiny fleeting jewels. I placed my hand flat on the cool wet wood. It was solid, real, the last real thing. I didn't speak to the crowd. I spoke to him. "I did exactly as you wrote, Dad," I said. My voice was not a whisper, but it was not a shout. It was a statement, a report delivered across a vast, silent divide meant only for him and for the wind to carry away, just like we planned. A small commotion drew my eyes for a moment. Far across the lawn, near the wrought iron gates of the cemetery, a small drama was playing out its final pathetic scene. Karen was struggling against the two security guards. Her body language a symphony of impotent rage. She kept trying to turn, to look back, to scream something else that no one would hear. Chad was already gone from her side. I saw him near the parking lot, a lone figure hurrying away under a large black umbrella. His head bowed, his face hidden from the world, retreating from the battlefield his mother had chosen. He was a ghost already fading into the gray mist. I turned my attention back to the casket, back to what mattered. Harlan Reed stepped up beside me, extending his own umbrella to cover me again. In his other hand, he held out a crisply folded white handkerchief. It was made of fine linen. In the corner, embroidered in a simple dark blue thread, were 3 letters, R.H. Richard Hayes. It was my father's motto, the private philosophy he had drilled into me during our late-night sessions in his study. He believed that a person's true legacy was not their money or their name, but their voice, the clarity of their intent, the integrity of their word, made permanent and unassailable. For him, that voice was now enshrined in the legal documents that had just saved his life's work. It was a message, a final piece of instruction. The voice was now mine to use. I took the handkerchief, my fingers closing around the soft fabric. I nodded to read, a silent acknowledgement of everything he had done, of the trust my father had placed in him, in us. But I did not wipe my face. I did not cry. The tears had already been shed. They had fallen in the dead of night, in the sterile quiet of my father's study months ago. They had fallen onto the very pages we were studying, blurring the dense legal text of the no contest clause, the elegant cruelty of the springing proxy. We had grieved then together in the shadow of his impending death, mourning what was to come while we methodically built the weapons to fight for what would remain. We had cried over the necessity of it all. Today was not for tears. Today was for signatures and for gavels. As if on cue, the bell in the tower of the clubhouse began to toll again. A single resonant peal that cut through the sound of the rain. It was the final signal for the committal. To me it sounded exactly like the heavy definitive strike of a judge's gavel, closing the case forever. The priest began to recite the final prayers. A cemetery worker stepped forward with a silver shovel, lifting a small amount of wet earth. He held it out for me. I took the shovel, the handle cold and slick. I looked down into the grave, then at the casket. I turned the shovel and the earth fell. It made a soft, hollow sound as it struck the lid. It was not a loud noise, but it was the loudest thing I had ever heard. It was the sound of finality, the sound of a door closing, a lock turning, the sound of the end. And in that moment, as the soft wet earth scattered across the polished wood, all the other noise in my life ceased. Karen's shrieks, Chad's cowardice, the whispers in the pews, the hum of association machinery. It all fell away, erased by that one simple sound. All that was left was a single, quiet, unshakable truth. I did not need biology. I did not need anyone's approval. I did not need their DNA to carry the name Hayes. My father had given it to me legally and absolutely. And today I had earned it. The committal was finished. The priest offered a final quiet prayer that was stolen by the wind. And then he, along with the few remaining mourners, began to retreat, their duty done. They left a landscape of dark umbrellas moving slowly through the gray rain, an aerial ballet of departure. Soon only Harlan Reed and I were left standing by the grave. Two silent black-clad statues in the downpour. My gaze was fixed on the cemetery gates. The heavy oak doors of the clubhouse, which had framed Karen's grand entrance just hours before, now framed her ignominious exit. The security guards were polite but firm, their large frames flanking her as they walked her toward a waiting town car. She was no longer screaming, but her entire body was rigid with a fury that seemed to vibrate in the rain-soaked air. She was a queen being escorted from her own failed coup, stripped of her crown and her kingdom in the space of an afternoon. She did not look back. Chad was not with her. He had vanished completely, swallowed by the mist and his own cowardice. There was no final confrontation, no dramatic parting shot. He had simply ceased to exist, an irrelevant footnote in a story that was no longer about him. His exit was as insubstantial as his tenure at the association. A puff of smoke in the rain. The great doors of the clubhouse swung shut. The sound a dull, distant thud. It was over. My phone vibrated in my coat pocket, a low, insistent buzz against my hip. It was the only sound in the world besides the rain. I pulled it out, my fingers numb and clumsy with cold. The screen was slick with water, the droplets distorting the light. A single new text message had arrived. The sender was Eleanor Evans, the board secretary. The message contained no salutation, no condolences, no commentary. It was a statement of pure, efficient corporate fact stripped of all emotion. Minutes of emergency meeting filed. Resolution 2A passed. President Olivia Hayes. That was it. the entire war, the years of silent observation, the late-night planning sessions with my father, the tension, the fear, the final brutal confrontation. All of it distilled into 7 words on a glowing screen. It was the coldest, most beautiful thing I had ever read. This was the language of the new power. It didn't scream or plead. It simply stated what was. I stared at the screen for a long moment, letting the finality of it wash over me, colder than the rain. Then, with my thumb, I pressed the side button. The screen went dark. I slipped the phone back into my pocket. This victory was not a headline to be shared. It was a contract to be executed. Promise kept. It was private. "It's done," Harlan Reed said softly beside me. His voice was low, laced with a profound, bone-deep weariness that mirrored my own. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at the grave, at the fresh, dark mound of earth that now covered the walnut casket. I nodded, my eyes following his gaze. "Done," I replied. There was nothing else to say. We had won, but there was no elation, no surge of triumph. There would be no celebratory handshake, no embrace of shared victory. Such displays were for battles fought with less at stake. This was not a victory. It was a reclamation, painful, necessary surgery to save the life of the patient. The feeling that settled over me was not joy, but a vast, quiet, and deeply satisfying silence. It was the silence my father deserved, a silence finally free of the grating noise of Karen's ambition and Chad's incompetence. It was the silence of justice, and it was heavier and more profound than any applause. I turned away from Reed, away from the future that now waited for me, the association that was now my responsibility. I took 3 deliberate steps, my sensible leather shoes sinking slightly into the soft, wet grass, until I was standing at the foot of my father's grave once more. The rain continued to fall, washing the world clean. It ran down my face like tears, but my eyes were clear. I looked at the freshly turned earth, the final blanket over the man who had given me everything. Not in his blood, but in his trust, in his quiet, late-night lessons, and in his fierce, unwavering belief in the power of a well-written clause, in the steady drumming of the rain. I spoke one last time, my voice for him alone. "Your daughter just took it all back." Cut. And thank you so much for listening to this story. I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from. So please drop a comment below and let's connect and share our thoughts. If you enjoyed this journey, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and if you'd like to give it an extra boost, hit that hype button to help this story be heard by more people.